probably should have said tonight selected readings of Edgar Allan Poe. But with that, music goes down, voice comes up, and we are back live. Welcome to another Sunday night edition of Accessibly Live, the book club reading room. How's everyone doing? Hope everyone's having a really great weekend. We are marching towards the end of October, which means spectacular events, not only Halloween, but lots of mazes in your local cities, states that farmers have made to kind of show off their talents. Minnesota, Iowa, many states have really very cool mazes written into their old cornfields that they're about ready to take down. And if you haven't gone on one, go explore. It's kind of fun. Tonight, as you saw earlier, we have selected readings tonight from the legendary American author Edgar Allan Poe. Um, we discovered that Poe did actually a short story that is, believe it or not, only 2 pages. Yeah, it's only 2 pages. And we're going to do that one first, and then we are going into the classic Fall of the House of Usher. And we're going to do that tonight. One of the things, reminder that we are accessibly live here at the book club reading room. We read public domain books only. In not in next Sunday, the 27th, we've got something different. We got something really exciting for everybody because for the first time, we're showing a movie. And it's not an ordinary movie, it is a classic horror movie. The movie that Dracula was based off of. The 1926 film Nosferatu will be here live and on tape delay if you miss it or miss parts of it. It is a silent movie, which means there is no talking. There are little banners come up during the movie which tell you the conversation of the actors. One of the things about a silent movie is you also look at the body language and eye looks and stares and that sort of thing that belong to the actors in front of the camera. Some pretty amazing stuff. But on October 27th, next Sunday, and Halloween night on the Thursday night edition of Accessibly Live, the conversation station, we'll be preempting it with some Nosferatu, a replay. So, kind of excited for everybody to come in and join us. For anybody who likes a classic horror movie that is silent, bring your popcorn, bring your bring your Mountain Dew because it will may not be for everybody, but we thought we'd kind of do something fun for everybody on the 27th. So stop in. And while you're stopping in, don't forget to like and subscribe here to the channel. We appreciate everybody who's been stopping in, saying hello, sending emails. That I appreciate. Appreciate everybody who's been doing this. Now, Edgar Allan Poe is one of those writers that delved into things where most writers will touch upon, but not, just kind of skirt the horror and macabre feeling of a story. Poe was for the what way he lived and when he lived was a genius. Edgar Allan Poe was born January 18th, 1809, but died 1849. He lived only 39 years, guys. 40 years, actually. And his writing was absolutely brilliant. He lived a short life, but his accomplishments were great for everything that he did. He was a writer, poet, editor, author, literary critic, and his works have and will transcend time. You see the movies all the time. How Edgar Allan Poe died, though, is full of speculation. Rumors from a brain tumor, cholera, rabies, syphilis, and influenza, among many theories. One of the things that came up in the research was that when he died, when he was with his doctor, it is said that he said the following: God save this poor soul. Something similar to that. And there's been discussion of what was actually said, but that was what the doctor had said. Um, he lived his life and he did a hell of a job as a writer. As I said, we have two stories tonight. One is probably one of the shortest short story horror macabre mysteries that you've ever read. It is called The Oval Portrait, and it's still, for what Poe created, gets to the point immediately. It's kind of fun to read, nice and simple. So, beyond that, let's get started here on Accessibly Live, the book club reading room. Let's start the show with The Oval Portrait by Edgar Allan Poe. The chateau into which my valet had ventured to make forcible entrance, rather than permit me, in my desperately wounded condition, to pass a night in an open air, was one of those piles of commingled gloom and grandeur which have so long among the Apennines, not less than a fact that it had fancy of Mrs. Radcliffe. To all appearance, it had been temporarily and very lately abandoned. We established ourselves in one of the smallest and least sumptuously furnished apartments. It lay in a remote turret of the building. Its decorations were rich, yet tattered and antique. Its walls were hung with tapestry and bedecked with manifold and multiform armorial trophies, together with an unusual great number of very spirited modern paintings in frames of rich golden arabesque. In these paintings, which depended from walls, not only in their main surfaces, but in very, very many nooks which the bizarre architecture of the chateau rendered necessary. In these paintings, my incipient delirium, perhaps, had caused me to take deep interest. So I bade Pedro to close the heavy shutters of the room, since it was already night, to light the tongues of the tall candelabra which stood at the head of my bed, and to throw open far and wide the fringed curtains of the black velvet which enveloped the bed itself. I wished all this done, that I might resign myself, if not to sleep, at least alternately to the contemplation of these pictures, and the perusal of a small volume which had been found upon a pillow, which purported to criticize and describe them. Long, long I read, and devoutly I gazed. Rapidly and glorious the hours flew by, and the deep midnight came. The position of the candelabra displeased me, and I outreached my hand with difficulty. Rather than disturbing my slumbering valet, I placed it so that it threw its rays more fully upon the book. but the action produced an effect altogether unanticipated. The rays of the numerous candles, for there were many, now fell within a niche of the room which hitherto had been thrown into dark, deep shade by one of the bedposts. I thus saw in the vivid light a picture all unnoticed before. It was the portrait of a young girl just ripening into womanhood. I glanced at the painting hurriedly and then closed my eyes. Why I did this was not at first apparent, even though to my own perception, but while my lids remained thus shut, I ran over in my mind my reason for so shutting them. It was an impulsive movement to gain time for thought, to make sure that the vision had not deceived me, to calm and subdue my fancy for a more sober and more certain gaze. In a very few moments, I again looked fixedly at the painting. That I now saw a light, I could not and would not doubt, for the first flashings of the candles upon the canvas had seemed to dissipate the dreamy stupor in which was stealing over my senses, and to startle me at once into walking life. The portrait, as I have already said, was that of a young girl. It was a mere head and shoulders done in what technically termed vignette manner, much of the style of the favorite heads of Sully. The arms, the bosom, and even the ends of the radiant hair melted imperceptibly into a vague yet deep shadow which formed the black ground of the whole. The frame was oval, rich, gilded, and filigreed in Morocco. As a thing of art, nothing could be more admirable than the painting itself. But it could have been either the execution of the work, nor the immortal beauty of the countenance, which had so suddenly and vehemently moved me. Least of all could it have been at my fancy, shaken from its half slumber, had mistaken the head for that of a living person. I saw at once that the particularities of the design, of the vignetting, and the frame must have instantly dispelled such ideas, for must have prevented even the momentary entertainment. Thinking earnestly upon these points, I remained for an hour perhaps, half sitting, half reclining, with my vision riveted upon the portrait. At length, satisfied with the true secret of its effects, I fell back within the bed. I had found the spell of the picture in which absolute lifelikeness of the expression which, at first startling, finally confounded and subdued and appalled me. Deep, reverent awe, I replaced the candelabra in its former position. The cause of my deep agitation being thus shut from view, I sought eagerly the volume which discussed the paintings, their histories. Turning to the number which designated the oval portrait, I there read the vague and quaint words which follow. She was a maiden of rarest beauty, and not more lovely than full of glee. And evil was the hour when she saw and loved and wedded the painter. He, passionate, studious, austere, and having already a bride in his art; she, a maiden of rarest beauty, and not more lovely than full of glee, all light and smiles and frolicsome as of young fawns, loving and cherishing all things, hating only the art which was her rival, dreading only the palette and the brushes, and other untoward instruments which deprived her of the countenance of her lover. It was thus a terrible thing for this lady to hear the painter speak of his desire to portray even a younger bride. But she was humble and obedient, and sat meekly for many weeks in the dark, high turret chamber, where the light dripped upon the pale canvas only from overhead. But he, the painter, took his glory in his work, which went from hour to hour and from day to day. He was a passionate and wild and moody man, who became lost in reveries, so that he would not see the light which fell so ghastly in the lone turret, withered in health and the spirits of his bride, who pined visibly to all but him. Yet she smiled on, and still on, uncomplainingly, become she saw the painter, whom had high renown, took a fervid and burning pleasure in his task, and wrought day and night to depict her who so loved him, yet who grew daily more dispirited and weak. And in sooth, some who beheld the portrait spoke of its resemblance in low words, as of a mighty marvel, and a proof not less of the power of the painter, and then of the deep love for her whom he depicted so surpassingly well. But at length, as the labor drew nearer to its conclusion, there were admitted none into the turret, for the painter had grown wild with the ardor of his work, and turned his eyes from canvas merely, even to regard the countenance of his wife. And he would not see that the tints which he spread upon the canvas were drawn from the cheeks of her who sat beside him. And when many weeks had passed, and but little reminded to us, save one brush upon the mouth, and one tint upon the eye, the spirit of the lady again flickered up in the flame within the socket of the lamp. And then the brush was given, and then the tint was placed, and for a moment the painter stood entranced before the work which he had wrought. But in the next, while he gazed, he grew tremulous and very pallid and aghast, and crying with a loud voice, "This is indeed life itself," turned suddenly to regard his beloved. She was dead. The Oval Portrait by Edgar Allan Poe, American author. Hope you liked that. That was, like I said, short for what Edgar Allan Poe has written in his past. One of those books that gained not a lot of notoriety from his other works, but still gave the reader exactly what Poe has done in many of his great works. We are going to continue with the next story. This is one of the more well known stories of Edgar Allan Poe. Movie has been made, I think, once or twice regarding this. It is a little more in depth than the couple pages that I just read for the Oval Portrait, but this is still one of Edgar Allan Poe's best works. This, the final story for the night, The Fall of the House of Usher. And you'll excuse me if my French pronunciation is not so good anymore. Son corps est en lutte suspendu, c'était qui le touche la raison de Bergeron. During the whole of the dull, dark, and soundless day in the autumn of the year, when the clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens, I had been passing alone on horseback through a singularly dreary tract of country, and at length found myself at the shades of evening drew on, within the view of a melancholy house of Usher. I know not how it was, but with the first glimpse of the building, a sense of insufferable gloom pervaded my spirit. I say insufferable, for the feeling was unrelieved by any of that half pleasurable yet poetic sentiment with which the mind usually receives even the sternest natural images of the desolate or terrible. I looked upon the scene before me, upon the mere house and the simple landscape features of the domain, upon the bleak walls, upon the vacant eye like windows, upon the few rake sedges, and upon the few white trunks of decayed trees, with an utter depression of soul which I can compare to no earthly sensation more properly than to the after dream of the reveler upon opium. The bitter lapse into everyday life, the hideous dropping off of the veil. There was an iciness, a sinking, a sickening of the heart, an unredeemed dreariness of thought which no goading of the imagination could torture into aught of the sublime. What was it? I paused to think. What was it that so unnerved me in the contemplation of the house of Usher? It was a mystery all insolvable, nor could I grapple with the shadowy fancies that crowded upon me as I pondered. I was forced to fall upon back upon the unsatisfactory conclusion that while, beyond doubt, there are combinations of very simple natural objects which have the power of thus affecting us, still the analysis of this power lies within considerations beyond our depth. It was possible, I reflected, that a mere different arrangement of the particulars of the scene, of the details of the picture, would be sufficient to modify or perhaps to annihilate its capacity for sorrowful impression. And, acting upon this idea, I reined my horse to the precipitous brink of a black and lurid tarn that lay in unruffled luster by the dwelling, and gazed down, but with a shudder even more thrilling than before, upon the remodeled and inverted images of the gray sedge, and the ghastly tree stems, and the vacant and eye like windows. Nevertheless, in the mansion of the gloom, I now proposed to myself a sojourn of some weeks. Its proprietor, Roderick Usher, had been one of my boon companions in boyhood, but in many years had elapsed either in our last meeting. A letter, however, had lately reached me in a distant part of the country, a letter from him, which, in its wild importunitude of nature, had admitted of no other than a personal reply. The MS gave evidence of a nervous agitation. The writer spoke of acute bodily illness, of a mental disorder which oppressed him, and of an earnest desire to see me as his best, and indeed his only personal friend, with a view of tempting by the cheerfulness of my society some alleviation of his malady. It was the manner in which all this and much more was said. It was apparent heart that went with his request, which followed me no room for hesitation, and I accordingly obeyed forthwith what I still considered a very singular summons. Although, as boys, we had been even intimate associates, Yet I really knew little of my friend. His reserve has always excessive and habitual. I was aware, however, that his very ancient family had been noted, time out of mind, for a peculiar sensibility of temperament, displaying itself throughout the ages in many works of exalted art, and manifested of late in repeated deeds of manifest yet unobtrusive charity, as well as a passionate devotion to intricacies, perhaps even more than the orthodox and easily recognizable beauties of musical science. I had learned too that the very remarkable fact that the stem of the Usher race, all time honored as it was, had put forth at no period any enduring branch. In other words, the entire family lay in the direct line of descent, and had always, with a very trifling and very temporary variation, so lain. It was this deficiency I considered, while running over in my thoughts the perfect keeping of the character of the premises with the accredited character of the people, and while speculating upon the possible influences which the one, in the long lapse of his centuries, might have exercised upon the other. It was this deficiency, perhaps, of collateral use, and the consequent and undeviating transmission from sire to son of the patrimony with the name, which had at length so identified the two as to merge the original title of the estate in the quaint and equivocal application of the House of Usher, an application which seemed to include in all the minds of the peasantry who used it both the family and the family mansion. I have said that the sole effect of my somewhat childish experiment, that of looking down within the tarn, had been to deepen the first singular impression. There can be no doubt that the conscientious of the rapid increase of my superstition, for why should I not so term it, served mainly to accelerate the increase itself. Such, I have known, is the paradoxical law of all sentiments having terror as the basis. And it might have been for this reason only that when I again uplifted my eyes to the house itself, from its image in the pool, there grew in my mind a strange fancy, a fancy so ridiculous indeed, that I but mention it to show the vivid force of the sensations which oppressed me. I had so worked upon my imagination as really to believe about the whole mansion and the domain there hung in an atmosphere peculiar to themselves and their immediate vicinity, an atmosphere which had no affinity to the air of heaven, but which had reeked up from the decayed trees and the gray wall and the still tarn, a pestilent and mystic vapor, dull, sluggish, faintly discernible, and leaden hued. Shaking off from my spirit must what must have been a dream, I scanned more narrowly the real aspect of the building. Its principal feature seemed to be that of an excessive antiquity. The discoloration of ages had been great. Minute fungi overspread the whole exterior, hanging in a fine tangle web work from the eaves. Yet all of this was apart from any extraordinary dilapidation. No portion of the masonry had fallen, and there appeared to be a wild inconsistency between its still perfect adaptation of parts and the crumbling condition of the individual stones. In this there was much to remind me of the specious totality of old woodwork which had rotted for long years in some neglected vault, with no disturbance from the breath of external air. Beyond this indication of extensive decay, however, the fabric gave little token of instability. Perhaps the eye of the scrutinizing observer might have discovered a barely perceptible fissure which, extending from the roof of the building in front, made its way down the wall in a zigzag direction until it became lost in the sullen waters of the Tarn. Noticing these things, I rode over a short causeway to the house. A servant in waiting took my horse, and I entered the Gothic archway of the hall. A valet, of stealthy step, hence conducted me in silence through the many dark and intricate passages to my progress to the studio of his master. Much that I encountered on the way and contributed, I know not how, to the heighten of the vague sentiments of which I have already spoken. While the objects around me, while the carvings of the ceilings, and somber tapestries of the walls, the ebon blackness of the floors, and the phantasmagoric a- armoral trophies which rattled as I strode, were but matters of to which, or to such as which, I had been accustomed from my infancy. While I hesitated not to acknowledge how familiar was all of this, I still how wondered to find how unfamiliar were the fancies which ordinary images were stirring up. On one of the staircases, I met the physician of the family. His countenance, I thought, wore a mingled expression of low cunning and perplexity. He accosted me with trepidation and passed on. The valet now threw open a door and ushered me into the presence of his master. The room in which I found myself was very large and lofty. The windows were long and narrow and pointed at so vast a distance from the black oaken floor as to be altogether inaccessible from within. Feeble gleams of encrimsoned light made their way through the trellised panes, and served to render insufficiently distinct the more prominent objects around. The eye, however, struggled in vain to reach the remoter angles of the chamber, or the recesses of the vaulted and fretted ceiling. Dark tapestries, dark draperies, sorry guys, hung upon the walls. The general furniture was profuse, comfortless, antique, and tattered. Many books and musical instruments lay scattered about, but failed to give any vitality to the scene. I felt that I breathed in an atmosphere of sorrow. An air of stern, deep, and irredeemable gloom hung over and pervaded all. Upon my entrance, Usher arose from a sofa on which he had been lying at full length, and greeted me with a vivacious warmth which had much in it. I had first thought of an overdose of cordiality, of a constrained effort of the ennuyé man of the world. A glance, however, at his countenance convinced me of his perfect sincerity. We sat down, and for some moments, while he spoke not, I gazed upon him with the feeling half of pity, half of awe. Surely man had never before so terribly altered in so brief a period as had Roderick Usher. It was with difficulty that I could bring myself to admit the identity of the Wayne being before me with the comprehension of my early boyhood. Yet the character of his face had been at all times remarkable. The cadaverousness of his complexion, an eye large, liquid, and luminous beyond comparison, lips somewhat thin and very pallid, but of a surprisingly beautiful curve, a nose of delicate Hebrew model, but with a breadth of nostril unusual in similar formation, a fine modeled chin, speaking in the want prominence of a want of moral energy, hair of more than web like softness and tenuity. These features, with an inordinate expansion above the regions of the temple, made up altogether a countenance not easily to be forgotten. Had not and now, in the mere exaggeration of the prevailing character of these features, and of the expression they wont to convey, lays so much of change that I doubt to whom I spoke. But now ghastly pallor of the skin, and now miraculous luster of the eye, above all things startled and even awed to me. The silken hair, too, had been stuffed to grow all unheeded, and as, in its wild gossamer texture, it floated rather than fell about the face, I could not, even with effort, connect its arabesque expression with any idea of simple humanity. In a matter of my friend, I was at once struck with an incoherence, an inconsistency, and I soon found this to arise from a series of feeble and futile struggles to overcome an habitual trepidation, an excessive nervous agitation. For something of this nature I had indeed been prepared, no less by his letter than by reminiscences of certain boyish traits, and by conclusions deduced from his peculiar physical formation and temperament. His action was alternately vivacious and sullen. His voice varied rapidly from a tremulous indecision, which the animal spirits seemed utterly in absence, to the species of energetic concision, that abrupt, weighty, unhurried, and hollow sounding enu- enu- enunciation. Uh, sorry, guys, rented lips today. That leadened, self balanced, and perfectly modulated guttural utterances, which may be observed in the lost drunkard or the irreclaimable eater of opium during the periods of his most intense excitement. It was thus that he spoke of the object of my visit, of his earnest desire to see me, and of the solace he expected me to afford him. He entered at some length into what he conceived to be the nature of his malady. It was, he said, a constitutional and family evil, and one for which he despaired to find a remedy. A mere nervous affection, he immediately added, which would undoubtedly soon pass off. It displayed itself in a host of unnatural sensations. Some of these, as he detailed them, interested and bewildered me, although perhaps the terms and the general manner of the narration had their weight. He suffered much from a morbid acuteness of the senses. The most insipid food was alone endurable. He could wear only garments of certain texture. The odors of all flowers were oppressive. His eyes were tortured by even a faint light, and there were but peculiar sounds, and these from stringed lights, which I do not inspire him with horror. To an anomalous species of terror, I found him abundant slave. I shall perish, he said. I must perish in all this deplorable folly. Thus, and not otherwise, shall I be lost. I dread the events of the future, not in themselves, but in their results. I shudder at the thought of any, even at the most trivial incident, which may operate upon his intolerable agitation of soul. I have indeed no abhorrence of danger, except in its absolute effect, in terror. In this unnerved, in this pitiable condition, I feel that the period will sooner or later arrive when I must abandon life and reason together in some struggle with grim phantasm, fear. I learn, moreover, at intervals and through broken and equivocal hints, another singular feature of his mental condition. He was enchained by certain superstitious impressions in which in regards to the dwelling which he tenanted, and whence for many years he had never ventured forth, in regard to an influence whose superstitious force was conveyed in terms too shadowy here to be reinstated, an influence which some peculiarities in the mere form and substance of the family mansion had, by dint of long sufferance, he said, obtained over his spirit, an effective which the physique of the grey walls and turrets and the dim tarn had into which they all looked down had, at length, brought upon the morale of his existence. He admitted, however, although with hesitation, that much of the peculiar gloom which thus affected him could be traced to a more natural and far more palatable origin, to the severe and long continued illness, indeed, to the evidently approaching dissolution of a tenderly beloved sister, his sole companion for long years, his last and only relative on earth. Her decease, he said, with a bitterness which I can never forget, would leave him in the hopeless and the frail, the last of the ancient race of the Ushers. While he spoke, the Lady Madeline, for so was she called, passed slowly through a remote portion of the apartment, and, without having noticed my presence, disappeared. I regarded her with an utter astonishment not unmingled with dread, and I found it impossible to account for such feelings. A sensation of stupor oppressed me as my eyes following her retreating steps. When a door at length closed upon her, my glance sought instinctively and eagerly the countenance of the brother, but he had buried his face in his hands, and I could only perceive that a far more than ordinary wanness had overspread the emaciated fingers through which trickled many passionate tears. The disease of the Lady Madeline had long baffled the skill of her physicians. A settled apathy, a gradual wasting away of the person, infrequent, altogether transient affections of the partially catapa- cataleptic character, were the unusual diagnosis. Here, too, she had steadily borne upon against the pressure of her malady, and had not betaken herself finally to bed. But on the closing in of the evening of my arrival at the house, she succumbed, as her brother told me at night with inexpressible agitation, to the prostrating power of the destroyer. And I learned that the glimpse I had obtained of her person would thus probably be the last I should obtain, that the lady, at least while living, would be seen by me no more. For several days ensuing, Her name was unmentioned by either Usher or myself. And during this period, I busied in earnest endeavors to alleviate the melancholy of my friend. We painted and read together, nor I listened as if in a dream to the wild improvisations of his speaking guitar. And thus, as a closer and still closer intimacy admitted me into unreservedly into the recesses of his spirit, the more bitterly did I perceive the futility of all attempt at cheering a mind from which darkness, as if inherent positive quality, poured forth upon all objects of the moral and physical universe into one unceasing radiation of gloom. I shall never bear upon me a memory of the many solemn hours I thus spent alone with the master of the house of Usher. Yet, should I fail in any attempt to convey the idea of the exact characters of the study, or of the occupations in which he involved me or led me the way, an excited and highly distempered ideali- ideality drew a sulphurous luster over all. His long improvised dirges all ring forever in my ears. Among other things, I hold painfully in mind a certain singular perversion and amplification of a wild air of the last waltz of von Weber. From the paintings over which he elaborated fancy brooded, in which grew touch by touch into vagueness, at which I shuddered, the more thrilling because I shuddered knowing not why from these paintings, vivid as the images are before me. I would in vain endeavor to educe more than a small portion of which he lie within the compass of merely written words. By the utter simplicity of the nakedness of his designs, he arrested and overawed attention. If ever mortal painted an idea, that mortal was Roderick Usher. For me, at least, in the circumstances then surrounding me, there arose out of the pure abstractions which the hypochondriac contrived to throw upon the canvas an intensity of intolerable awe, no shadow of which felt I ever in the contemplation of the certainly glowing, yet too concrete reveries of Fuseli. One of the phantasmagoric conceptions of my friend, partaking not so rigidly of the spirit of abstraction, may be shadowed forth, although feebly, in words. A small picture presented the interior of an immensely long and rectangular vault or tunnel, with low walls, smooth, white, and without interruption or device. Certain accessory points of the design served well to convey the idea that this excavation lay at an exceeding depth below the surface of the earth. No outlet was observed in any portion of this vast extent, and no torch or other artificial source of light was discernible. Yet a flood of intense rays rolled throughout and bathed the whole in a ghastly and inappropriate splendor. I had just spoken of that morbid condition of the auditory nerve in which rendered all music intolerable to the sufferer, with the exception of certain effects of the stringed instruments. It was perhaps the narrow limits to which he thus confined himself upon the guitar, which gave birth to great measures to the fantastic character of his performances. But the fevered facility of his impromptus could not be so accounted. They must have been and were in the notes as well as in the words of his wild fantasias, for he not unfrequently accompanied himself with the rhymed verbal improvisations. The result of that intense mental collectedness and concentration to which he had previously alluded as observable only in particular moments of the highest artificial excitement. The words of one of these rhapsodies I have easily remembered. I was, perhaps, the more forcibly impressed with it as he gave it, because in the under or mystic current of the meaning, I fancied that I perceived in perhaps other time a full consciousness on the part of the usher of the tottering of his lofty reason upon her throne. The verses, which were entitled The Haunted Palace, ran very nearly, if not accurately, thus: In the greenest of valleys, by good angels tenanted, once a fair and stately palace, radiated palace, reared its head. In the monarch thought's domination, it stood there. Never seraph spread opinion over fabric half so fair. Banners yellow, glorious, golden, on the roof did float and flow. All this was in olden times long ago. And every gentle air that dallied in the sweet day along the ramparts plumbed and pallid, a winged odor went away. Wanderers in the happy valley through two luminous windows saw spirits moving musically to a lute's well tuned law. Round about a throne where sitting Polyphemus in state of glory well befitting the ruler of a realm was seen. And all with the pearl and ruby glowing was the fair palace door, through which came flowing, and sparkling evermore, a troop of echoes whose sweet duty was but to sing, in voices of surpassing beauty, the wit and wisdom of their. But evil things in robes of sorrow assailed the monarch's high estate. Ah, let us mourn, for nevermore shall dawn upon him desolate. And round about his home the glory that blushed and bloomed is but a dim remembered story of the old time entombed. And travelers now within that valley through the red litten windows see vast forms that move fantastically to a discordant melody, while like a rapid ghastly river through a pale door a hideous throng rush out forever, and laugh but smile no more. I well remember that suggestion arising from this ballad led us to a train of thoughts wherein there became a manifest of opinion of Usher's, while I mention not so much on account of its novelty, for other men have thus thought, as on account of the pernicity with which he maintained it. This opinion, in general form, was that the sentence of all vegetable things. But in his disordered fancy, the idea had assumed a more daring character and trespassed, under certain conditions, upon the kingdom of inorganization. I lack words to express the full extent or the earnest abandon of his persuasion. The belief, however, was connected, as I have previously hinted, with the gray stones of the home of his forefathers. The condition of the sentience had been there, he imagined, fulfilled in the method of collection of these stones, in the order of their arrangement, as well as that of the many fungi which overspread them, and of the decayed trees which stood around, above all, in a long undisturbed endurance of this arrangement, and in its reduplication in the still waters of the turn. Its evidence, the evidence of the sentience, was to be seen, he said, and I here started as he spoke, in the gradual yet certain condensation of the atmosphere of their own about the waters and the wells. The result was discoverable, he added, in the silent and importu and terrible influence which for centuries had molded the destinies of his families, and which made him what I now saw him, what he was. Such opinions need no comment, and I will make none. Watson, Dr. Percival, Spallanzani, and especially the Bishop of Landolph, see Kimmel Essays, Volume 5, are books, the books which, for years, had formed no small portion of the mental consistence of the invalid, were, as might be supposed, in strict keeping with this character of phantasm. We pored together over such works as the Vert of Chartreuse of Jarret, the Belfrage of Malachi, of the Belfrage of Machiavelli, the Heaven and Hell of Swedenborg, the Subterranean Voyage of Nicholas Klim by Holberg, the Chiromancy of Robert Flood, of Jean Derange, and the de la Chambre, the Journey into the Blue Distance of the Teak, and the City of the Sun of Campanella. One favorite volume was a small octavo edition of Directum Inquisitorium by the Dominican Iramark de Geron, and there were passages in Pompeius Mela about the old African satyrs and Egyptians, over which Usher would sit dreaming for hours. His chief delight, however, was found in the perusal of the exceedingly rare and curious book in the Quattro Gothic, the Manual of Forgotten Church, the Village Mortorium Sanctum Horum Elestium Magnatorium. I could not help thinking of the wild ritual of this work and of its probable influence upon the hypochondriac, when one evening, having informed me abruptly that the Lady Madeline was no more, he stated his intention of preserving her corpse for a fortnight, previously to its final interment, in one of the many numerous vaults within the main walls of the building. The worldly reason, however, assigned for this singular proceeding was which I did not feel at liberty to dispute. The brother had been led to his resolution, so he told me, by the consideration of the unusual character of the malady of the deceased, of certain obtrusive and eager inquiries on the part of her medical men, and of the remote and exposed situation of the burial ground of the family. I will not deny that when I called to mind the sinister countenance of the person of whom I met upon the staircase on the day of my arrival upon the house, I had no desire to oppose what I regarded as at best but a harmless and by no means unnatural precaution. At the request of Usher, I personally aided him in the arrangements for a temporary entombment. The body having been encoffined, we two alone bore it to its rest. The vault in which we placed it, and which had been so long unopened that our torches, half smothered in its oppressive atmosphere, gave us little opportunity for investigation, was small, damp, and entirely without means of admission for light, lying at great depth immediately beneath the portion of the building in which was my own sleeping apartment. It had been used apparently in remote feudal times for the worst purposes of donjon keep, and in later days as a place of deposit for powder or some other highly combustible substance, as a portion of the floor and the whole interior of the long archway through which we reached it were carefully sheathed with copper. The door, a mass of iron, had been also similarly protected. Its immense weight caused an unusual sharp grating sound as it moved upon its hinges. Having deposited our mournful burden upon the trestles within this region of horror, we partially turned aside the yet unscrewed lid of the coffin, and looked upon the face of the tenant. A striking similarity between the brother and sister now first arrested my attention, and Usher, divining perhaps my thoughts, murmured out some few words from which I learned that the deceased and himself had been twins, and that sympathies of a scarcely intelligible nature had always existed between them. Our glances, however, rested not long upon the dead, for we could not regard her unawed. The disease which had thus entombed the lady in the maturity of youth had left her. As unusual in all maladies of a strictly cata- cataleptic character, the mockery of the faint blush upon her bosom and the face, and that suspiciously lingering smile upon the lips, was so terrible in death. We replaced and screwed down the lid, and having secured the door of iron, made our way with toil into the scarcely less gloomy apartments of the upper portion of the house. And now, some days later, of bitter grief having elapsed, an observable change came over the features of the mentally disordered of my friend. His ordinary manner had vanished. His ordinary occupations were neglected or forgotten. He roamed from chamber to chamber with hurried, unequal, and objectless step. His pallor of his countenance had assumed, if possible, a more ghastly hue, but the luminous of his eyes had utterly gone out. The once occasional huskness of his tone was heard no more, and a tremulous quaver, as if a extreme terror habitually characterized his utterance. There were times, indeed, when I thought his unceasing agitated mind was laboring with some oppressive secret, to divulge which he struggled for the necessary courage. At times, again, I was obliged to resolve all into the mere inexplicable vagueness of madness, for I beheld him gazing upon vacancy for long hours in an attitude of the profoundest attention, as if listening to some imaginary sound. It was no wonder that his condition terrified, and it affected me. I felt creeping upon me by slow yet certain degrees the wild influences of his own fantastic yet impressive superstitions. It was, especially upon retiring to bed late in the night of the seventh or eighth day after the placing of Lady Madeline within the dungeon, that I experienced the full power of such feelings. Sleep came not near my couch, while the hours waned and waned away. I struggled to reason off the nervousness which had domain over me. I endeavored to believe that much, with not at all what I felt, was due to the bewildering influences of the gloomy furniture of the room, of the dark and tattered draperies, in which, tortured, motioned by the breathing of the rising tempest, swayed fitfully to and fro upon the walls, and rustled uneasily about the decorations of the bed. But my efforts were fruitless. An irrepressible tremor gradually pervaded my frame, and at length there sat upon my very heart an incubus of utterly causing alarm. Shaking this off with a gasp and struggle, I uplifted myself upon the pillows, and peering earnestly within the intense darkness of the chamber, hearkened, I know not why, except that I had an instinctive spirit prompted me, to certain low and indefinite sounds which came through the pauses of the storm at long intervals. I knew not whence, overpowered by an intense sentiment of horror, unaccountable yet endurable, I threw on my clothes with haste, for I felt that I should sleep no more during that night, and endeavored to arouse myself from the pitiful conditions into which I had fallen, by pacing rapidly to and fro through the apartment. I had taken a few turns in this manner, when a light step on an adjoining staircase arrested my attention. I presently recognized it that of Usher. In an instant afterward he rapped. With a gentle touch of the door he entered, bearing a lamp. His countenance was, as usual, cadaverously wan, and moreover there was a species of mad hilarity in his eyes, and evidently restrained hysteria in his whole demeanor. His air appalled me, but anything was preferable to the solitude of which so long endured, and I even welcomed his presence as a relief. "And you have not seen it," he said abruptly, after having stared about him for some moments in silence. "You have not then seen it? But stay, you shall." Thus speaking, and having carefully shaded his lamp, he hurried to one of the casements, and threw it freely open into the storm. An impetuous fury of the entering gust nearly lifted us from our feet. It was, indeed, a tempestuous yet sternly beautiful night, and one wildly singular in its terror and its beauty. A whirlwind had apparently collected its force in our vicinity, for there were frequent and violent altercations in the direction of the wind, and the exceeding density of the clouds, which hung so low as to press upon the turrets of the house, did not prevent our perceiving the lifelike velocity from which they flew careening from all points against each other, without passing away into the distance. I say that even their exceeding density did not prevent our perceiving this, yet we had no glimpse of the moon or the stars, nor was there any flashing forth of lightning. But under the surface of the huge masses of agitated vapor, as well as all terrestrial objects immediately around us, were glowing in the unnatural light of a faintly luminous and distinctively visible gaseous exhalation which hung about and enshrouded the mansion. You must not, You shall not behold this, said I, shuddering, shudderingly to Usher as I led him with a gentle violence from the window to the seat. These appearances which bewilder you are merely electrical phenomena, not uncommon, nor may it be that they have their own ghastly origin in the rank mesmia of the Terran. Let us close this encasement. The air is chilling and dangerous to your frame. Here is one of your favorite romances. I will read, and you shall listen, and so we shall pass away this terrible night together. The antique volume which I had taken up was the Mad Trist of Sir Launcelot Canning, but I had called it a favorite of Usher's more in sad jest than in earnest. For, in truth, there was little in its uncouth and unimaginative proximity which could have had interest for the lofty and spiritual ideality of my friend. It was, however, the only book immediately at hand, and I indulged a vague hope that the excitement which now agitated the hypochondriac might find relief, for the history of the mental disorder is full of similar anomalies, even in the extremeness of the folly which I should read. Could I have judged, indeed, by the wild, overstrained air of the vivacity with which he hearkened, or apparently hearkened, to the words of the tale, I might as well have congratulated myself upon the success of my design. I had arrived at that well known portion of the story where Ethrold, the hero of the tryst, having sought in vain for peaceable admission into the dwelling of the hermit, proceeds to make good of an entrance by force. Here, it will be remembered, the words of the narrative run thus. And Ethrold, who was by nature a doughty heart, and who by now mighty withal, on account of the powerfulness of the wine which he had drunken, waited no longer to the parley with the hermit, who, in sooth, was an obstinate and maliceful turn, but feeling the rain upon his shoulders, and fearing the rising of the tempest, uplifted his mace upright, and with blows made quickly room of the plankings of the door, which his gauntleted hand, and now pulling therewith sturdily, he so cracked and ripped and tore all asunder. All the noise of the dry and hollowed sounding wood alarmed and reverberated throughout the forest. At the termination of this sentence, I started, and for a moment paused, for it appeared to me, although I at once concluded that my excited fancy had deceived me, it appeared to me that for some very remote portion of the mansion there came indistinctly to my ears what might have been, in the exact similarity to the character, the echo, but a stifled and dull one certainly, of a very cracking and ripping sound which Sir Launcelot had so particularly described. It was, beyond doubt, their coincidence alone which had arrested my attention, for amid the rattling of the sashes of the casements and the ordinary commingling noises of the still increasing sound of the storm, the sound, in itself, had nothing surely with which could have interested or disturbed me. I continued the story. But the good champion Ethrold, now entering within the door, was sore enraged and amazed to perceive no single of a maliceful hermit, but in the stead, therefore, a dragon of a scale and prodigious demeanor, and a fiery tongue which sate in guard before the palace of gold, with a floor of silver, and upon the wall there hung a shield of shining brass, with this legend enwritten: Who entereth wherein a conqueror hath been, who slayeth the dragon, the shield he shall win. Etherald uplifted his mace, and struck upon the head of the dragon, which fell before him, and gave up its pesty breath, with a shriek so horrid and harsh, and withal of so piercing, that Ethrol. Hang on a second, guys. Got to do something there. There we go. Etherald so feigned to his close his ears, with his hand against the dreadful noise of it, the like there whereof was never before heard. Here again I paused abruptly, and now with a feeling of wild amazement, for there could be no doubt whatever in this instance. I did actually hear, although from the direction it proceeded I found it impossible to say, a low, apparently distant, but harsh, protracted, and mostly unusual screaming or grating sound, the exact counterpart of which my fancy had already conjured up for the dragon's unnatural strength, as described by the romancer. Oppressed, as I certainly was, upon the occurrence of this second and most extraordinary coincidence, by the thousand conflicting sensations in the wonder and the extreme terror in the predominant, I still retained sufficient presence of mind to avoid exciting by any observation the sensitive nervousness of my companion. I was by no means certain that he had noticed the sounds in question, although assuredly a strange altercation had, during the last few moments, taken place from his demeanor. From a position fronting my own, he had gradually brought around his chair so as it to sit with his face to the door of the chamber, and thus I could partially perceive his features, although I saw that his lips trembled as they were murmuring inaudibly. His head had dropped upon his breast, yet I knew he was not asleep. From the wide and rigid opening of the eyes I caught a glance of its profile. The motion of his body, too, was at variance with his idea, for it rocked from side to side with a gentle yet constant and uniform sway. Having rapidly taken notice of all this, I resumed the narrative of Sir Lancelot, which thus proceeded. And now the champion, having escaped from the terrible fury of the dragon, bethinking himself of the brazen shield and the breaking up of the enchantment which had upon it, removed the carcass out of the way before him, and approached valorlessly over the silver pavement of the castle to where the shield was upon the wall, which in sooth tarried not for his full coming, but fell down on his feet upon the silvery floor with a mighty great and terrible ringing sound. No sooner had I said these syllables past my lips than, as if the shield of brass had indeed at the moment fallen heavily upon the floor of silver, I became aware of a distinct hollow metallic and clankerous, yet apparently muffled reverberation. Completely unnerved, I leaped to my feet and measured the rocking movement of Usher was undisturbed. I rushed to the chair in which he sat. His eyes were bent fixedly before him, and throughout the whole countenance there reigned stony rigidity. But as I placed my hand upon his shoulder, there came a strong shudder over his whole person. A sickly smile quivered about his lips, and I saw that he spoke in a low, hurried, and gibbering murmur, as if unconscious of my presence. Bending closely over him, I had at length to drink in the hideous import of his words. Not hear it? Yes, I hear it. I have heard it. Long, long, long. Many minutes, many hours, many days I have heard it. And yet I dare not, oh, pity me, merc- miserable wretch that I am. I dare not speak. We have put her living in the tomb. Said I not that my senses were acute? And now I tell you that I heard for first feeble moments in the hollow coffin. I heard them many, many days ago, and I dare not speak. And now, tonight, Ethelred, ha ha! The breaking of the hermit's door, and the death cry of the dragon, and the clangor of the shield, say rather, rendering her coffin, and the grating of the iron hinges of her prison, and her struggles within the coppered archway of the vault. Oh, hither shall I fly. Will she not be here anon? Is she not hurried up to braid me for my haste? Have I not heard her footsteps on the stairs? Do I not hear that heavy and horrible beating of her heart? Madman! Here he sprang furiously to his feet and shrieked out these syllables as if effort were giving up his soul. Madman, tell you that she now stands without the door. As if in a superhuman energy of the utterance of he had found the potency of a spell, the huge antique panels to which the speaker pointed threw slowly back upon the instant, and their ponderous ebony jaws. It was the work of the gusting rust, but then without those doors there did stand the lofty and enshrouded figure of the Lady Madeline of Usher. There was blood upon her white robes, and the evidence of some bitter struggle upon every portion of her emaciated frame. For a moment she remained trembling and reeling to and fro upon the threshold, then with a low moaning cry fell heavily inward upon the person of her brother, and in her violent and now final death agonies bore him to the floor a corpse, and a victim to the terrors he anticipated. From that chamber, and from the mansion, I fled aghast. The storm was still abroad in all its wrath as I found myself crossing old causeways. Suddenly there was a shot along the path in a wild light, and I turned to see whence a gleam so unusual could have issued. From the vast house, and its shadows were alone behind me. The radiance was that of the full setting and the blood red moon, which now shone vividly through that once barely discernible fissure of which I had before spoken, as exceeding from the roof of the building in a zigzag direction of the base. While I gazed, the fissure rapidly widened. There came a fierce breath of the whirlwind, and the entire orb of the satellite burst at once upon my sight. My brain reeled as I saw the mighty walls rushing asunder. There was a long, tremulous shouting sound like that of a voice of 1,000 waters, and the deep and dank tarn at my feet closed suddenly and silently over the fragments of the house of Usher. That is one of the finest stories that Edgar Allan Poe has ever written. Fall of the House of Usher. He knew how to tell a tale. He threw a lot of detail into his work, and his storytelling was always tremendous. I've always liked Edgar Allan Poe. His work always made me think in the storytelling in the final destruction of the house of Usher. We see the protagonist get away and look back to see the ending of his friend. I hope you like the stories. I hope you like both of them, The Oval Portrait and The Fall of the House of Usher, here on Accessibly Live, the book club reading room. This is the email. Give me a yell sometime. Let me know how you guys are doing. I hear occasionally from people down in Texas, up in Canada, over on the East Coast. I appreciate everybody watching. Thank you. Thank you all for watching. Um, as always, I remind people and ask, if you get a chance, like and subscribe. We are always working hard to make sure that we do a good job for you. Now, a reminder, next week, the 27th, we have something very different, something very exciting here on the channel. For the first time, other than me reading a story that's in public domain, we will be showing you a story that's in public domain. Because next week, on the 27th, we will be presenting Nosferatu, the original vampire movie. It's 1926, guys. It is a silent movie, which means that there is no speaking. Words come up in during conversations with one character or another to tell the story, and soft music is usually playing that helps set the tone for the movie, is always playing in behind. That will be next Sunday, and I hope you enjoy. Hope you join me for that. Like and subscribe. Come on in. Tell your friends. Anybody who likes classic movies, who enjoy something a little bit different, something you don't normally see here on Twitch or YouTube. Something different, something a lot of fun. Because we had Edgar Allan Poe as our featured author tonight, we always do a final quote for everybody, kind of to wrap up what's been going on. And from Poe, this is one of his best. Those who dream by day are cognizant of the many things which escape those who dream only by night. Those who dream by day are cognizant of many things which escape those who dream only by night. It is true. For those of you who daydream, who use your imagination to write stories, write poetry, come up with great ideas for the future, all come through the wonderful time of daydreaming, which we all need to do once in a while. We all need to sit back, kick back, and relax. It's the right thing to do. We all need to kick back. It's one reason why we do the show here. When I'm reading, you guys get to kick back, relax, turn off the lights, and just let the enjoyment begin. And I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed Edgar Allan Poe tonight. As I said, next week we will be doing Nosferatu. And I hope you enjoy it. Bring some popcorn, bring something to drink, turn it on, and enjoy it. I'm going to wrap up. Thank you all for tuning in. This is Accessibly Live, the book club reading room, every single Sunday night here, not only on Twitch, but also on YouTube. And I appreciate everybody who's been here and who stops by and says hello. Be well, be safe, be kind. Take care, all. We will talk to you and see you this coming Thursday. We have ghost stories on the conversation station this week. We're having a little bit different fun. We're continuing the storytelling in a more spooktacular vein. This coming Thursday on Accessibly Live, the conversation station. Be well, be safe, be kind. Take care, all. For those of you who are in the middle of MEA, NEA throughout the U.S., everybody is having a great week. Please continue to do so. I am Joel K. Thank you all for stopping in, and we will see you all this coming Thursday for some ghost stories on Accessibly Live, the conversation station. Take care, all.